BBC News at 1 o'clock with Simon McCoy.
Another breakthrough in the battle against coronavirus, a vaccine which data suggests is nearly 95% effective. After these trials in the United States, its makers, Moderna, described the discovery as a crucial milestone.
I broke into an ear-to-ear grin when I heard the numbers. It really exceeded our best hopes. And it is an incredibly exciting moment for us as a company and as a world as we start to develop tools to fight the virus.
Well, the markets have reacted positively. We'll be assessing this latest bit of good news with our medical editor. Also this lunchtime, on a day he hoped to reframe his premiership after days of infighting, Boris Johnson is instead self-isolating in Downing Street.
It doesn't matter that I'm fit as a butcher's dog, feel great, so many people do in my circumstances, and actually it doesn't matter that I've had the disease and I'm bursting with antibodies. We've got to interrupt the spread of the disease.
A warning from patients and staff at a hospital in an area with the highest COVID rates in the country.
The Delta's out there who don't believe in it. It's here. And this is very busy. The nurses don't stop.
I personally don't cope well in a lockdown situation. I hate every minute of it. But I'd be the first to say that our restrictions now are probably not tight enough because we're getting too many patients coming in.
Hopes that families will be allowed to visit residents in all care homes before Christmas after successful trials for rapid testing of visitors.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
Launch of the Space Taxi. A private rocket carries 4 astronauts to the space station and saves NASA billions of dollars.
And coming up on BBC News, time to put pen to paper. The boss at Mercedes says he's confident Lewis Hamilton will sign for another year after claiming his record-equalling 7th driver's title.
Good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1. A second coronavirus vaccine has been found to be highly effective at preventing COVID-19 infections. Interim results suggest it's 94.5% effective at stopping symptomatic infections. The trial is ongoing and the US firm Moderna plans to apply to regulators in the coming weeks to get approval for emergency use of the jab. The results come hot on the heels of similar results from Pfizer and add to growing confidence that vaccines can help to end the pandemic. Our health correspondent Dominic Hughes reports.
Hot on the heels of last week's vaccine breakthrough, another promising candidate, this time from a US company called Moderna, which has just announced the results of a trial involving more than 30,000 people. The company is reporting the vaccine is nearly 95% effective.
I broke into an ear-to-ear grin when I heard the numbers. It really exceeded our best hopes. And it is an incredibly exciting moment for us as a company and as a world as we start to develop tools to fight the virus. It is a moment only because we realize very quickly we have a lot of work to do to beat back the pandemic, but it's a great moment to have.
The Moderna vaccine is one of a number that's being tested around the world. There are now 48 in development. 11 of them are in the final stage of testing known as Phase 3. One of those is the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine announced last week, with early results indicating it can prevent more than 90% of infections. 2 others at the final stage of testing are also being trialled in the UK, the University of Oxford vaccine and one from the US firm Novavax. And today news of a third UK trial for the Belgian company Janssen, which aims to recruit 6,000 participants. Experts warn that when it comes to a vaccine, we need to keep our options open.
One vaccine might not suit certain parts of the population, so one vaccine might be better for one particular age group or one particular area of population diversity. So it's really important that we continue to develop the other vaccines because it's unlikely that one size will fit all.
This is one reason why the UK government has options to buy a total of 350 million doses of 6 different vaccines. Negotiations to buy a significant number of Moderna doses are also said to be at an advanced stage. And ministers say preparations for rolling out the Pfizer vaccine are well underway.
We may be able to start rolling it out before Christmas, but almost certainly the vast bulk of the rollout. If the safety data prove that it's safe, and that is still not known, we still don't have a vaccine, but even if we do, it's likely that the bulk of the rollout would be in the new year.
But with alternate vaccines potentially coming on stream, there won't be a choice over which one we get. Some may work better for different parts of the community.
The Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation has decided who would be the most priority, and that starts with the elderly and people in care homes. But obviously, if something comes up that the vaccine works differently in different age groups, that may need to be modified.
There are still many questions around all the vaccines produced so far. How long will immunity last? How will they work in older age groups? Will they stop people not just falling ill, but also from spreading the virus? But still, what we're seeing with vaccine development is remarkable. A process that normally takes years, compressed down to months. Dominic Hughes, BBC News.
Our medical editor Fergus Walsh is here. Is this a cause for optimism or excitement?
Both, Simon. I'm, if I could be, even more excited than I was last Monday, because now we have another COVID vaccine using a very similar approach, which has also proved over 90% effective. So it's in a way a confirmation that that result last week wasn't some kind of freak. It suggests that science is going to find a path out of the pandemic for us. And other vaccines, as Dominic said in his report, are on the way. So I'm really hopeful now, even more hopeful than I was last week, that we're moving in the right direction. We do need to be cautious. It is early data. We need the safety data. There's lots of I's to dot and T's to cross, but it's looking good.
All that said, how quickly could we get it here?
So the Moderna vaccine, we don't have advance orders for that, but the company told me this morning that they have been in discussions with the UK government and they hope to be able to supply doses here by spring 2021. We should not count on a vaccine to help us out really this winter. This is really for 2021. So, for the next few months, we're going to have to rely on all the things we've been relying on, social distancing, hand hygiene, etc., etc. But it looks like 2021 could be very different as a result of vaccines to the current situation we're in now.
We're beginning to like Mondays, aren't we?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much. Boris Johnson has said he is feeling fit as a butcher's dog on his first working day, self-isolating in Downing Street. The PM and several other Tory MPs have been told to isolate by NHS Test and Trace after a meeting at Downing Street where one of the MPs later tested positive for COVID-19. Our political correspondent Chris Mason reports.
This was last Thursday morning. The Prime Minister had a breakfast meeting with some of his MPs, including the man on the right, Lee Anderson, who the day after lost his sense of taste and later tested positive. And so the Prime Minister is holed up in his Downing Street flat until a week on Thursday.
Hi folks, the good news is that NHS Test and Trace is working ever more efficiently. The bad news is that they pinged me and I've got to self-isolate. It doesn't matter that we were all doing social distancing. It doesn't matter that I'm fit as a butcher's dog, feel great. So many people do in my circumstances. And actually, it doesn't matter that I've had the disease and I'm bursting with antibodies. We've got to interrupt the spread of the disease.
His neighbour's getting some fresh air, though. The Chancellor was in East London this morning.
Like all other businesses and organisations over the past few months, he's been learning to do things differently. We're doing a lot of meetings online. The Prime Minister's already, this morning, you've seen a video that he's put out. We're getting on with delivering people's priorities.
The Prime Minister's not the only one doing a stint of domestic incarceration. Other MPs at the same meeting left with a beaming picture with the boss and a later instruction to stay at home. So Boris Johnson's been told to stay in here. On Friday, his chief advisor Dominic Cummings was told to get out. After the volcanic disputes and dysfunction in Number 10 recently, today was meant to be about a reset. It still will be, I'm told, but it'll be a remote one. The capacity of COVID to cripple our plans strikes once again here at the heart of government. After the comings and goings, the Prime Minister's now staying inside when he'd really hoped to be out and about, sweeping up the mess of the last week.
Let's speak to Chris now. He's in Downing Street. Not the start of the week the Prime Minister wanted.
Quite, Simon. Afternoon to you. The grand plan was that the Prime Minister, as I was saying, would be out and about before the events of last night. It was about 8:30 last night that Downing Street told us that the Prime Minister would be self-isolating. His team had been setting out, I think, what they'd have hoped would have looked like a pretty energetic plan for the coming weeks, whether that be trying to secure a Brexit deal, lots of COVID meetings. Obviously, there was a plan to meet Northern Conservative MPs who've been grumbling about a lack of attention in the last couple of months, particularly around those regional restrictions of a couple of weeks back. Conversations with the Chancellor about the upcoming spending review, a big plan on the environment that's been a long time in the making in private, a 10-point plan. Governments love a 10-point plan, all about emphasising the Prime Minister's agenda, which the advisers he's still got in there say was always his agenda, but with the likely change in tone and perhaps emphasis given the departees of a couple of days ago, Mr Cummings and Mr Kane. Instead, he finds himself holed up in there for the next 10 days. Still lots of questions this lunchtime, Simon, about exactly what was going on with that meeting last Thursday. Did it really need to happen physically? What about those photos where it didn't look like they were anywhere near 2 metres apart? Lots of conversations going on right now between reporters and Downing Street along those lines. Instead, the Prime Minister, I guess, trying to make a virtue out of the fact that he's having to follow the rules and stay in his flat in the hope that plenty of other people do, at a time when the virus is still looking pretty shaky, isn't it, those numbers, and emphasising the importance of responsible behaviour. Chris
Mason, thank you. There's growing concern amongst health bosses in Hull as the area has become the worst hit in the country by COVID-19. The council's leader has described the local situation as a health emergency and is urging the Prime Minister to take more action. Vicky Johnson reports now from the Hull Royal Infirmary.
Stepping through to the sharp end of this pandemic, Hull's intensive care unit. Out on the streets, people are getting tired of the restrictions. Here on the front line, they're battle weary.
It's overwhelming. I've never had a year like this in my whole career as a nurse. We have a sense of dread about what the next 6 months will be.
During the first peak in the spring, they had 112 patients at Hull Royal Infirmary with coronavirus. Today, there are more than 150, but they're expecting even more.
It feels like it could rapidly escalate out of control with nothing that we can really do to prevent it.
We're getting busy, and it's getting busy at an alarming rate. It's just, we're getting patient after patient in, and we're seeing a greater number of admissions than we saw last time.
Laura is just 31. She admits she never took the threat of the virus seriously until now.
I didn't wear a mask because of my mental health, and I didn't think I was going to get it, and it just proves it wrong. I've never really been ill.
Sharon's been in ICU for a fortnight and admits she's been fighting for her life.
Very bad, yeah. Where I maybe thought at one point, is it going to go too far and they can't do anything for me?
And Ray had this message to those who don't think things are that bad.
Only for the doubters out there who don't believe in it. It's here. And this is very busy. The nurses don't stop.
Staff here have tried so hard to keep other services going, but now routine operations and appointments are having to be cancelled.
Staff who would normally work in operating theatres are going to be redeployed here to support the nurses and doctors working in intensive care. As in March, coronavirus is disrupting the whole functioning of the hospital.
8 months into this pandemic, and the doctors and nurses are quite simply running on empty.
I've got nurses in there who have been here a lot longer than what I have, but they're starting to buckle, and you rely on them staff. Them staff are seeing it at home, they're seeing it at work. There's been no let-up since the last time it came.
It must take a toll.
It does. I've got 2 little ones at home, and to have to come home from here, and I go home and I just try and click into mum, which is quite difficult because you know you've been in here, you know you've been with infected patients.
Most of us are getting fed up of the restrictions on our lives, but the nurses here think we could do more.
I personally don't cope well in a lockdown situation. I hate every minute of it, but I'd be the first to say that our restrictions now are probably not tight enough because we're getting too many patients coming in.
Sentiments echoed by the Trust's chief executive. Today, the leader of the City Council has called the local situation a health emergency and has urged the government to take action to support the city. Vicky Johnson, BBC News, Hull.
And we'll have a special programme at 4:30 covering the Downing Street press conference led by the Health Secretary Matt Hancock on BBC One and on the BBC News channel. Talks to thrash out a post-Brexit trade agreement have resumed in Brussels, with both sides calling for compromises to be made. In a moment, we'll be live in Brussels. But first, our reality check correspondent Chris Morris takes us through the key sticking points.
Any free trade deal agreed in the next few weeks won't be particularly ambitious. There hasn't been time for that. But even with fairly limited aims, negotiators are still struggling with some familiar themes. First, the level playing field. Measures to ensure companies on one side don't have an unfair advantage over their competitors on the other. All trade agreements have them, but the EU wants the UK to stick particularly closely to its rules on things like workers' rights, environmental regulations, and especially state aid or financial support for businesses. The UK, on the other hand, says the whole point of Brexit was to break free from following common rules. Second, fisheries. The EU is pushing for maximum access for its boats to continue fishing in UK waters, whereas British negotiators say the UK is now an independent coastal state and its boats will get priority. If there's no agreement on fishing, EU boats will lose out badly, but the UK won't get the access it wants to the EU markets, where it sells most of its fish and many other things besides. Then there's the governance of any future agreement. That's partly about the overall structure of any deal, but also how a new agreement would be enforced and how disputes would be settled. Another sensitive issue, implementing the Brexit withdrawal agreement signed last year, especially the protocol on Northern Ireland and the land border, which now divides the UK from the EU. The UK's internal market bill, which could override parts of the Northern Ireland Protocol, has added to EU concerns that the UK may not live up to some of the commitments it's made. So, plenty of issues to resolve, and it normally takes years to do a trade deal. But this process only has a matter of weeks left. Deadlines have already come and gone. Any last-minute agreements still need to be added to hundreds of pages of legal text, and it all needs to be translated into all EU languages and ratified by parliaments on both sides before the end of next month. Even with a deal, the UK's relationship with the EU will be very different outside the single market and the customs union. There will be far more bureaucracy for businesses that trade across the border, and free movement of people in both directions will come to an end. Any agreement would do very little for the trade in services, but it would mean avoiding tariffs or taxes on goods crossing the border. Is that enough to tip the balance? Well, even at this very late stage, there are no guarantees. Politicians on both sides need to make concessions on some pretty fundamental issues. But we may know more before the end of this week.
Another crucial week. Well, our Europe correspondent Nick Beake is in Brussels, and if they had an equivalent phrase for déjà vu there, they'd be using it.
Simon, I know it, you know it, I think everyone watching knows it. These Brexit deadlines seem to come and go. The latest they had in mind was this Thursday. That's because a video call of the 27 EU leaders is taking place. The hope was they'd be able to look at something. It looks highly unlikely that that will happen. But I tell you what, there is this one deadline that's simply not going away. There's 6 weeks till the end of the year. The transition phase ends then. Britain's position in the transition period will be ending. One thing they're looking at from the European side, just talking to a few people over the last few hours, is whether there's a discernible change in tone or content from the British side now that Dominic Cummings has left Downing Street. He, of course, a key architect of the Brexit project. If you look at the tweets that Lord Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, sent out in the last 24 hours or so, he said he'd only sign up to a deal if it took back control of British trade, British laws and British waters, who of course came up with that phrase, Dominic Cummings. The British say they are not shifting on this. It is, Simon, I'm afraid to say, a crucial week.
Nick, thank you very much. Nick Beake. Coming up to 1:20, our top story this lunchtime. Another breakthrough in the battle against coronavirus, a vaccine which data suggests is nearly 95% effective. And still to come, how Scotland's football celebrations put a 4 decades old hit back at the top of the charts.
Coming up on BBC News, Ireland left with a dilemma for the number 10 shirt and the captaincy for this weekend's Autumn Nations Cup clash with England after Johnny Sexton's ruled out with a hamstring injury.
Families should be allowed to visit residents in all care homes in England before Christmas after successful trials for rapid testing of visitors. The Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, says it is his goal to ensure testing is available at all homes. It comes as a pilot scheme begins today, which would allow more contact between residents and their families. Jane McCubbin reports.
These are the images that have marked a long 8 months of isolation and separation for so many. Today, a very small number of care homes will finally open their doors with regular testing for relatives.
Here's our lovely bunch. Wave, everybody!
This is Meadway in Winchester.
The best home north of the South Pole.
And one of the luckiest, because it's one of only 20 homes taking part in this pilot, and residents like John are so excited.
You're going to be able to have visits with your daughters, and you're going to be able to give them a hug and hold their hand for the first time in 8 months.
Hug them? I'm not sure. Am I going to be able to hug them? That's what I've been longing to do since Christmas.
Yeah.
Oh, it'll be marvellous.
It's made possible through the use of lateral flow tests, the kind of tests being used in Liverpool's mass screening right now. Up to 2 relatives or friends can have regular tests to facilitate the kind of visit that hasn't been possible since early March.
Do you remember that visit?
I do, yes. I had an afternoon tea with my friend in my room. It was lovely.
How much have you missed that?
Oh, yes, indeed. There's nothing like the one-to-one contact. Yes, the hug. That gives you something, doesn't it, the hug?
This was the first time Simon saw his 98-year-old mum Marjorie after lockdown Mark 1.
Gus, you said Gus.
Since then, visits have been restricted to video conference calls or at a distance in the garden. Today, that all changes.
I think the advantage, if it all comes off, is it opens up all possibilities. And when I see Mum, I can talk with her, I can hug her, I can hold her. It's just going to be great.
But all of this will have to be in full PPE. Masks and gloves are still essential and will still be a barrier to communication.
It's very hard for these new tests to perform very well. They're very simple technologies. They're not going to be able to detect virus like the PCR test does. They give you a very immediate assessment of whether you have a lot of virus right now, but it doesn't mean that you're going to be clear of virus and safe.
For those homes not included, the wait has been unbearable. For those lucky few, it is the first tentative step towards the normality they have been longing for. Jane McCubbin, BBC News.
Our social affairs correspondent Alison Holt is here with me now. Visits by Christmas, that's the promise. How likely is it?
Well, that is the big question. Certainly the Health and Social Care Secretary, Matt Hancock, was sounding very confident this morning that it would be possible to roll out testing to the roughly 15,000 care homes in England. But the pilot's only starting today, and it involves 20 homes, not the 30 we were originally told that were going to be involved. It's being rolled out in areas of low prevalence of the virus, so Hampshire, Cornwall and Devon. There'll be regular testing offered to one family member or one friend, and that should allow them to have these more meaningful visits that we heard about from Jane's. But PPE will still be there, and there will still be restrictions and measures. The department was saying any national rollout will be phased and dependent on the results of this pilot. But for the many relatives and residents who've been desperate for this, they've been calling for it since the summer, they don't see any reason why, if care homes are made a priority, why this shouldn't work. And they point to scientific advice, which suggests the risks from visiting are low, and also to visiting guidance in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which is already more generous.
Alison, thank you very much. 19 million NHS dental treatments have been missed since the start of the coronavirus lockdown in March. That's according to figures seen by BBC News. The British Dental Association has warned the Health Secretary that the drop in patient numbers could result in hundreds of dentists across the UK going bust over the next year. And it's not just the dentists who are suffering, as Dan Johnson reports.
The pain starts to become excruciating, like I'd imagine acid being poured in the eye.
Listen to what toothache did to Tim, and imagine dealing with that much pain.
A filling that fell out and a tooth that had shattered into pieces. There was 2 or 3 teeth next to it that had all got together and formed one big infection that had gone right up that nerve into the sinuses and around to the top of the eye, and was basically like having somebody pushing in your eye really, really hard.
He was suffering with an abscess, starting to go blind, and despite many calls and even a visit to hospital, he couldn't see a dentist because he wasn't registered and treatment was restricted.
I got the sense that they were all closed, and that if you were suffering, the best thing you could do was go home and suffer.
After 8 months in pain, friends covered the cost of private treatment here. But other patients are still reluctantly being turned away or kept waiting.
Tim's story made me cry. I know it touched the hearts of my team. It's not what you train to do. It's as a hygienist that manages a practice, my dentists feel the same, my staff feel the same. It's heartbreaking. We're going to see rising gum disease, rising mouth cancer, rising anxiety, rising mental health because people lose teeth. So it doesn't bode well for the future of dentistry.
The wait to get in here only looks likely to get longer because dentists are still restricted in the treatments they can offer and the number of patients they can see. So they're likely to suffer more, and dentists are wondering about their future prospects. And the question being asked is, what's the government's commitment here to the future of dentistry?
The Department of Health and Social Care told us priority access should be given to urgent care and vulnerable patients, and it says the NHS is working with the profession to make more treatment available. But there are questions about the way dentists will be paid in future and what that will mean for waiting lists. Here, leaving an hour between patients and the cost of mountains of protective equipment is putting this practice and hundreds more at risk.
Before COVID-19, we used to see about 20 to 30 patients a day. We're now barely seeing 10. And we're just trying to help patients. We're open to almost 11 o'clock at night, and we want to carry on doing that. But we're going to need some help.
Tim's now on the mend, but other patients are still struggling to get seen. And if some dentists don't survive, that will only get worse.
I wouldn't recommend having this if you're poor or marginalised in any way. The difference between NHS and private could mean the difference between suffering and not suffering.
Dan Johnson, BBC News, Brighton.
They're calling it the new normal in space travel. NASA's first fully fledged mission has launched using a privately owned craft, which will act as a space taxi service in the coming years. 4 astronauts are on board the SpaceX rocket on their way to the International Space Station. Our science correspondent Victoria Gill reports.
3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
A spectacular show and a space exploration milestone.
Resilience rises. Not even gravity contains humanity when we explore as one for all.
The launch of this SpaceX Dragon capsule with its 4 crew marks a new era, one in which the US Space Agency buys seats for its astronauts on a privately owned spacecraft. The Space Shuttle, retired almost a decade ago, was the last craft that was certified to fly NASA astronauts from American soil. But now the agency will work in partnership with SpaceX, taking crew to and from the International Space Station.
That's inside Crew Dragon right now. Our Crew 1 crew now coasting in low Earth orbits.
Sunday's launch is the culmination of years of design and testing. But the demonstration flight back in May was the test that the world was watching. And SpaceX successfully transported 2 astronauts to the space station and brought them home safely. The 4 people on this first fully operational flight, NASA astronauts Michael Hopkins, Victor Glover and Shannon Walker, and the Japanese Space Agency astronaut Soichi Noguchi, will bring the number of crew on the International Space Station to 7. NASA says this will triple the amount of microgravity research that can be done.
There are over 250 experiments that take place on the International Space Station at any one time, and they are in all sorts of different areas. So a lot of the research that is done is involved in medicines and in helping to understand how the human body works. It's a truly international endeavour, and the countries coming together is what we need in a human exploration.
This group will spend about 6 months in space, looking back on Earth as the crisis of the pandemic continues to unfold. And in a nod to a mission accomplished during this most turbulent of years, they've called their ship Resilience. Victoria Gill, BBC News.
Finally, this lunchtime, a disco classic from 1977 has re-entered the charts thanks to this. Yes, Sir, I Can Boogie has become the unofficial anthem for Scotland's men's football team after their celebrations for their win against Serbia last week, which saw them clinch a place in next year's Euros. It's now reached number 3 in the UK's commercial radio chart, higher than the likes of Sam Smith, Miley Cyrus and Ariana Grande. Higher than the likes of. Now, let's have a look at the weather forecast now with Darren Bett.
Thanks very much, Simon. I'm going to head to the Caribbean first of all, where we find our record-breaking hurricane season continuing. This is Hurricane Iota, and it's continuing to strengthen. It's going to become a catastrophic Category 5 storm, 190-mile-an-hour winds, half a metre of rain, and making landfall in Central America later tonight. Now, moving towards the UK, and we're drawing in some tropical air. For us, that means that we've got some higher temperatures than normal. There's a lot of cloud, mind you, and these weather fronts will focus the rain. This one getting stuck in Western Scotland in the next few days, threatening some flooding by midweek. This afternoon, though, maybe some weak sunshine for eastern areas. Out to the west, though, the cloud is already thickening. We're getting some patchy rain coming in, and temperatures around 11 or 12 degrees. Now, through this evening and into the night, we'll see this patchy rain pushing its way further east across the UK, but the rain really setting in across western Scotland through the Highlands and into Argyll and Bute. But if anything, overnight, with that milder air coming in, temperatures will be rising 12 to 14 degrees by the end of the night, and by this point, we'll have a stronger southwesterly wind. Now, that tomorrow is going to blow in a lot of cloud and maybe some damp and drizzly weather over the hills, but that rain will continue, I think, across western parts of Scotland. Now, it's going to be a very mild day. Temperatures generally 15 or 16 degrees, but could be even higher than that where we get some sunshine to the east of high ground. But that rain is still around, and it'll still be around probably into Wednesday as well. But for the next couple of days, we're getting the air coming from the south, hence those higher temperatures. But look what happens by the time we get to Thursday. The air will be much, much colder. And Wednesday is changing day. It's transition day. Now, we've still got low pressure around and some weather fronts. So the wettest weather during the day is going to be in Scotland. But there'll be some patchy lighter rain heading eastwards across England and Wales. Ahead of that, the last of that very mild air, because temperatures gradually through the afternoon will start to drop away. But the really cold air is yet to arrive, and during Wednesday night it'll get very windy. We could see a spell of wet weather coming in as well, and by Thursday morning some snow and some ice across northern parts of Scotland. And by the morning on Thursday, the strongest of the winds will be down these North Sea coasts. There'll be some sunshine and some showers around, but as we head into the afternoon, the showers become fewer, there'll be more sunshine, and the winds gradually ease down as well. But for a while, it really is going to feel cold in the wind. These are the temperatures on Thursday: 7 in the central belt of Scotland, 9 in East Anglia, but it will become a little bit milder again on Friday.
Darren, thank you very much. A reminder of our top story. Another breakthrough in the battle against coronavirus, a vaccine which data suggests is nearly 95% effective. That's all from the BBC News at 1. On BBC One, we now join the BBC's news teams where you are. From me, a very good afternoon.